In the carefully managed world of modern politics, where parties increasingly converge on consensus positions that supposedly represent inevitability rather than choice, where net zero emissions targets are treated as settled science requiring no democratic debate, and where politicians who question climate orthodoxy are dismissed as deniers, refusing to accept reality, Tony Abbott has issued a challenge to the Liberal Party that cuts through years of cautious positioning and diplomatic language. Speaking to Peter Credlin on Sky News, the former Prime Minister delivered what amounts to a declaration of war against the entire framework of Australian climate policy, arguing that the coalition must draw a clear line between itself and Labour by abandoning net zero targets and prioritizing jobs, industries, and affordable energy over emission cuts that he describes as no more than nice to do. Welcome to Australian Enigma, where we expose the truth about how climate policy has become an economic straitjacket, driving insane subsidies across every sector of the energy market, and how the former Prime Minister, who signed Australia up to the Paris Agreement, now argues that pursuing net zero will not only cripple our economy, but devastate our countryside, with forests of wind turbines and carpets of solar panels covering an area almost twice the size of Tasmania. Subscribe now for daily analysis that refuses to accept the inevitability narrative when Abbott argues the policy debate is eminently winnable for a coalition willing to prosecute the argument day in, day out, right up until the next election. Abbott's intervention comes at a moment when the coalition is reportedly set to overhaul its approach to energy and net zero, with a focus on reliability and cost of living rather than emission reduction targets that have dominated policy discussions for the past decade. This represents a potential inflection point in Australian politics, where one major party explicitly rejects the framework that both sides have accepted, however reluctantly, since the Paris Agreement was signed. The question is whether the coalition leadership possesses the courage to follow through on what Abbott describes as a winnable fight, or whether they will retreat into the comfortable ambiguity of supporting net zero in principle whilst criticizing Labour's implementation in practice. Abbott's analysis begins with what he identifies as the first guiding principle emerging from coalition discussions, that affordable, abundant, reliable power must come first. This seems straightforward enough, almost unobjectionable. After all, who would argue against affordable and reliable power? But Abbott understands that this principle, if genuinely applied, is fundamentally incompatible with net zero targets that require transforming Australia's energy system regardless of cost or reliability concerns. You cannot put affordable, abundant, reliable power first whilst simultaneously prioritizing emission reductions that drive up costs and compromise reliability. These objectives are in direct conflict, and pretending otherwise is intellectual dishonesty. This is why Abbott concludes that the coalition is going to dump net zero, or at least why they should dump it if they are serious about the principle they have articulated. As he states with characteristic bluntness, you should never put cutting emissions ahead of saving jobs, keeping industries, and trying to make people's cost of living affordable. This is the fundamental choice that Australian politics has avoided confronting directly. We have instead pretended that technological progress will somehow resolve the conflict, that renewables will become so cheap that affordability and emission reduction align perfectly, that we can have our cake and eat it too. Abbott is calling out this pretense and demanding that the coalition choose which objective actually comes first. The requirement that any emerging policy present a very clear contrast with Labour is crucial to Abbott's argument. He understands that the Australian electorate has become deeply confused about where the major parties actually stand on energy policy. Both sides claim to support affordable power. Both sides claim to support emission reductions. Both sides claim to support reliability. But these claims ring hollow when voters look at their power bills or when industrial facilities close because energy costs make them uncompetitive. Abbott is arguing that the coalition needs to offer a genuine alternative, not merely criticism of Labour's implementation of shared objectives. This is where political courage becomes essential. It is easy to attack labor's energy policies as driving up costs and compromising reliability, whilst maintaining commitment to the same net zero targets that make those outcomes inevitable. It is much harder to explicitly reject the targets themselves, to argue that emission reduction should be subordinated to economic and industrial priorities, to risk being characterized as climate deniers or as refusing to accept scientific consensus. But Abott is arguing that this harder path is actually the politically smarter path, because it offers voters a real choice rather than competing versions of the same trajectory. Abbott's insistence that the coalition leadership must prosecute the argument day in, day out, right up until the next election, reveals his understanding of what this fight would require. You cannot drop net zero commitments in a single speech or policy document and expect that to be sufficient. The entire political and media establishment will mobilize to defend the consensus position. International pressure will be applied. Business groups that have invested in net zero strategies will object. Environmental organizations will launch campaigns. The ABC will run endless segments questioning the scientific literacy of coalition leaders. This is not a fight you win with a single bold announcement. This is a fight that requires sustained, consistent messaging over many months, explaining repeatedly why affordable energy and industrial preservation must come first before emission reduction targets that Australia cannot achieve without devastating economic consequences. The former Prime Minister's confidence that this is a winnable fight rests on his assessment of where the Australian public actually stands on these issues. Despite years of messaging about climate urgency, and despite the apparent consensus among political and business elites, polling consistently shows that voters prioritize cost of living and economic stability over environmental objectives when forced to choose between them. Labor won the last election partly on the promise that they could deliver cheaper power through renewable investment. That promise has proven false, as power prices have continued rising and as the costs of the energy transition have become impossible to hide. This creates an opening for the coalition to offer a fundamentally different approach, but only if they are willing to explicitly reject the framework rather than merely criticizing Labor's implementation within it. Abbott's description of cutting emissions as no more than nice to do will strike many as provocative or even outrageous given the emphasis placed on climate action in public discourse. But it's worth considering seriously what he means. If emission cuts require sacrificing jobs, closing industries, and making energy unaffordable for families, then those emission cuts are by definition not essential. They are a luxury that wealthy societies pursue when they can afford to do so without inflicting serious economic harm on their populations. Australia's total emissions represent roughly 1% of global totals. Even if we reduced our emissions to zero tomorrow, the impact on global climate would be statistically insignificant. The case for devastating our economy to achieve trivial global impact is weak, which is why Abott characterizes emission reduction as nice to do rather than essential. The reminder that Abott signed Australia up to the Paris Agreement during his time in office is crucial context. This is not someone who has always rejected climate action or who never accepted any emission reduction commitments. He can speak with authority about the conditions under which those commitments were made and about whether they have been exceeded. According to Abott, Cabinet was assured that Australia could achieve the 26 to 28% emissions reduction by 2030 without any new policies, without any costs, taxes, or additional interventions. It was on the basis of that absolute assurance that he agreed to the Paris commitments. If those assurances have proven false, if achieving the targets requires the kind of interventionist policies and subsidies that now characterize Australian energy markets, then the original agreement was made under false pretenses. Even more significantly, Abott points out that Australia actually met that 26 to 28% emissions reduction target years ago, making us one of the only countries to deliver on our Paris commitments.
Almost no other country has come close to meeting their emission reduction targets. Europe talks endlessly about climate leadership, but has failed to meet most of its targets. China continues building coal plants whilst making distant net zero promises. The United States commitment varies wildly depending on which administration is in power. Yet Australia, which represents a tiny fraction of global emissions and which achieved its targets without the dramatic interventions other countries claim are necessary, is somehow supposed to lead the way in economic self-harm to achieve further reductions that will make no measurable difference to global outcomes. This is the context in which Abott describes Labor's energy policy as an energy train wreck driven by an emission obsession. The characterization is harsh, but the evidence he cites is difficult to dispute.